Hey folks, in this next video we're going to be working our way through the forebrain. And the forebrain oftentimes is broken down into multiple parts because of how complex it gets here in the more sophisticated areas of our brains. So in this first part, we're going to talk about what's sometimes referred to as the diencephalon, though I don't necessarily need you to know that term. But these are the structures that are sitting at the cap of your brainstem. Okay, so this is technically part of the forebrain, but it is sitting at the top of the brainstem here. And these are some structures that you've probably heard of before. One of them is the thalamus, right here. And the thalamus sort of is the very top of the brainstem here. Oftentimes looks like a ball at the top of the brainstem. It actually has two hemispheres to it, just like your brain has two hemispheres. And it's got a bunch of axons in it, a bunch of nuclei in it that are very important. Hanging out just underneath, just anterior and a bit ventral or inferior to the thalamus is a structure called the hypothalamus. So it's referred to based on its location compared to the thalamus. It's hypo, kind of below or less than the thalamus. Okay, so let's talk about what these do. So the thalamus has a very important role as being a sensory relay. So it's kind of sitting in the center of your brain or in the center of your cerebrum there. Most of your sensory systems are going to send signals from um, your sensory receptors. And those are going to get relayed through the thalamus, eventually out to your cortex. So, for example, you see light waves with your eyes when you're looking at this screen. Those light waves hit the retina of your eyes. Those are receptors, right? That signal needs to get to your cerebral cortex eventually. Well, it doesn't go directly to your occipital lobe, which is where it'll eventually go. First, it goes through the thalamus. Okay, and from the thalamus, it will end up then getting directed to the right locations of your occipital lobe. The same thing is going to happen with your auditory system, with signals come in from your ears, the cochlea of your ears, right? Through the thalamus and then back to the temporal lobes. Same thing is going to happen with your sense of touch. The signals will come up through your skin, up your spinal cord, um, have all sorts of connections up through the brainstem that we've already talked about, through the midbrain, and then make their way through the thalamus first before finding their way to your parietal lobe. So that's going to work for basically all of your sensory systems. Interestingly enough, it's not how it works for your sense of smell. Your sense of smell does not go through the thalamus, but basically all the other ones do. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus. It's part of where it gets its name. It's connected to a very important structure called the pituitary gland, which is going to be a gland, which you might know that glands tend to be part of your endocrine system, or some glands are part of your endocrine system, which is where your hormones are released. So the hypothalamus is going to have a really important function in coordinating your endocrine or hormone system. So then you think about anything that's involved with hormone regulation. The hypothalamus is typically going to have some sort of a role. One way to think about those things is that they tend to be motivated behaviors. So feeding, fighting, fornicating, right? Fleeing. Those sorts of things tend to be hormone regulated. As a demonstration of that, this image over here is here for a reason. You have a rat on the left and a rat on the right. You'll see that the rat on the right is quite a bit larger to the extent that it can not really move on its own. They have to hold the other one in place, but not the one on the right. Well, why is it like that? Well, that rat had a part of its hypothalamus, a specific nucleus of the hypothalamus, was damaged or lesioned. And that nucleus was involved in regulating feeding behaviors, essentially um, telling your body that you're no longer hungry. So your hypothalamus is involved in your motivated behaviors, including eating behaviors. The optic chiasm is an important structure that shows up in this same place. It's right near the hypothalamus. The optic chiasm is a set of it's a structure, sort of, but it's really just the point where the two optic nerves cross. And this is going to be important for later on. I want you to know where this is. So this is right before you get to the thalamus. Your optic nerves coming off of the back of your eyes are actually going to cross. So some of the signals from my right eye will go to the left, and some of the signals from my left eye will go to the right. And that allows us to send signals from my right eye to both sides of the brain. The optic chiasm is where that happens, and it's right here, right next to the hypothalamus. Just breaking down some of the complexity of this, you can see the structure of the hypothalamus. Your book has in this image kind of broken down different nuclei of the hypothalamus. Each one of these has a slightly different function. So involved in regulation of different motivated behaviors or different regulation of hormones, depending on what they do. You can see the optic chiasm is crossing right in front of the hypothalamus. You can also see this structure called the pituitary gland kind of hanging off of the hypothalamus. So there's direct connections between your hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which allows your brain to control your hormone system. So that those structures are part of what's sometimes referred to as the diencephalon, right at the cap of your brainstem. Everything else that's part of your forebrain is sometimes referred to as the telencephalon. And again, I don't need you to memorize that term, but you can think of these kind of being together. Now, the rest of this structure, this telencephalon, is going to be oftentimes what you see when you look at a brain from the outside. It's going to involve the cerebral cortex. The cortex is the outer surface that includes both white matter and gray matter, which are different parts of the neuron we'll talk about. You'll see this arranged in ridges and furrows, right? You've got all these ridges in your cerebral cortex and all these furrows throughout. The technical names for those are each one is a gyrus and a sulcus, the plural of which are gyri and sulci. And these run all throughout the brain. Interesting thing about the gyri and the sulci, sometimes you might hear a myth that the more you learn, the more folds you get in your brain. Like you learn a new fact and you get a new fold in your brain. So people will have unique folds, and everybody's folds are going to be different based on what they know. In fact, that's not the case. Most of these structures, the gyruses and the sulci, are in more or less similar places across people. So those are kind of formed pretty similarly. Some of the sulci are so large and comprehensive furrows or grooves that they get a different name, and that name is a fissure. So there are some fissures in your brain that I'll show you a picture of on the next page. You have two hemispheres of the brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. They are, for the most part, not connected. But there are certain places where they do connect, and those have a name. Those are called commissures. The corpus callosum is the largest one of those. Corpus callosum means large body. Corpus is body. Colossus, right? Callosum, large body. So it's a large body of neurons connecting the two hemispheres. There are a few others as well. The main role, or the general role, for the cerebral cortex is to manage complex cognitive functions. So, things that you might be more consciously aware of, intending to do, those sorts of things. So, beyond just basic survival functions, or balance, coordination, or maintaining hormone regulation, that sort of thing, we're going to be getting a little bit more complex as we get into some of the functions of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex, you are probably aware, gets organized then into 4 lobes. Let's look at a picture of this, and then in the next video, we'll break down some of the functions. So, as I mentioned, your brain, your cerebral cortex has a number of gyri, these ridges, and then sulci, which are the furrows. There are some fissures. The fissures are these deep grooves, like this one here that is separating the 2 hemispheres, called the longitudinal fissure. While the 2 hemispheres are mostly disconnected, there are commissures, like this one and this one down here. This is this corpus callosum connecting the 2 hemispheres right here near the center of the brain. You'll also see, if you remember, we have these things called ventricles. These hold cerebrospinal fluid, which serves as a fluid-filled kind of buffer for protecting the brain. As I mentioned, we've organized a bit arbitrarily, to be honest, the cerebral cortex into 4 parts that we call lobes. And you've heard of these before, probably. In the front or the anterior side of the brain, we have the frontal lobe. There is a fissure running through the center of your brain here, running laterally. This is called the central fissure. That serves as the separation between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, which is just behind it. In the back or posterior side of your brain, we have the occipital lobe. And then here on the sides, on the lateral sides of both the left and the right hemisphere, we have the temporal lobe. Easy way to remember: the temporal lobe is that is behind your temples. So find the temples of your head, and it's right there behind your temples, and you're going to find your temporal lobes. Okay, in the next video, we'll break down the functions of these, and then we'll break down a few extra structures beyond the lobes that are up here in your cerebral cortex.